Hello everybody, welcome to the webinar this afternoon. This webinar is all about the Let's Talk About series that Be Human have been hosting, and today's session is about When the Heart Stops, a frank and fearless conversation about resuscitation. The webinar will be recorded, and the reason that we record them is so that others are able to see it publicly. Some people have difficulty attending the webinar, so the recording of it is both on a website but also put up on YouTube, so it's easily accessible from people's TVs and other sorts of mediums. So how to participate today, you'll see that you've got a box like this. There's a little hand, so after you've heard from the presenters, if you wanted to ask a question verbally, we can unmute you and you can come live then onto the webinar and ask your question personally. If you're not happy about your voice being over on the webinar, then you could use this question box and you can type in questions. So if you've got a question as some of the panelists are talking, you can actually pop it in there, and there's a small group of us behind who'll start picking that up and we'll ask that question on your behalf. If we do have an awful lot of questions and we haven't got time to answer them, we will take them and we'll do our best then to answer them and put a document out after the webinar to make sure that the questions are answered. If you're on an iPad, it's a slightly different version. It's like this, but you've still got the ask a question and you've still got the hand up so that we'll be able to bring you on live. If you've got any other questions around audio or technical, pop them in the questions or the chat box and we'll help you the best we can to make the best out of today's discussion. So what to expect today? I know some of you will have been expecting Baroness Jane Campbell to be on that list. She supported and encouraged us to run the webinar, and she was really looking forward to sharing her personal experience. But luckily for us, we've got Sue Bott, who's a good friend of Jane's, and he's going to relay some of Jane's story. Jane, very lucky for her and less for us, was able to get an appointment for a much needed operation. So Jane, if you're watching this on YouTube in another 2 weeks, we're so glad you're recovering well and we look forward to seeing you back on screen soon. So this is the panel we have today. We've got Dr. Kathryn Mannix, who's helped care for thousands of people at the end of their lives. And she's really compassionate, and she brings a compassionate wisdom to help us to start talking about this. She's also done a wonderful book about this, and there'll be a link at the end of the webinar for that. Matthew is a partner at Irwin Mitchell Solicitors, and he's going to bring some extensive legal experience in relation to the subject. And Sue Bott is a disabled person herself. She's from Disability Rights UK. She's a good friend of Jane's, so she'll be relaying some of Jane's story. And she's heard from many people about the fears and anxieties about the DNACPR situation. So she'll talk about that. And then you've got me, Julie Stansfield from In Control and part of Be Human. You've got Sharon Phillips and Gaynor, all as part, and we'll be sort of underneath in the background, hosting and facilitating and helping to get your questions across. So without further ado, I will invite Kathryn. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for coming and joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you so much for inviting me, and hello everybody who's joining us and everybody who's listening and watching later. So I'm a retired palliative care physician, or retired-ish, because I'm actually back in harness during COVID, briefly, I hope, and I've been campaigning for better public understanding of dying. So Julie's going to move my slides for me, and what I want to do is give you an overview of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, what it is, what it's for, what it will do, what it won't do. So CPR is first aid. It's an emergency first aid treatment that is used when somebody's heart stops suddenly and usually unexpectedly. And under those circumstances, the rest of the organs in their body would be working relatively normally. So this is a crisis because if the heart stops beating, the oxygen stops circulating in the blood and those organs start to become damaged and to die. And in particular, without oxygen, the brain will be dead within 6 minutes. So the emergency first aid treatment of CPR is external compressions on the chest, pushing down over the bottom of the breastbone, repeatedly, rhythmically, fast. Sometimes you hear people singing as they're doing that. They're not being flippant, they're trying to get the timing right. And what they're doing is pressing on the ribs hard enough to compress all of the organs in the chest, which squeezes the blood through the lungs, through the heart, and out into the rest of the body. And that first aid might keep the oxygen circulating enough to keep the person alive until the actual treatment for what's stopped their heart can be given. Now, sometimes the most treatable version of this is that the heart has stopped because instead of contracting rhythmically, like all of our hearts are doing at the moment, it started contracting chaotically. There's like an electrical storm in the heart that's called ventricular fibrillation, and that's when using a defibrillator that we're increasingly seeing around in public places in the UK. A defibrillator shocks the heart and puts the electrical rhythm back into normal rhythm, and if the heart hasn't been too badly damaged during that period, the electrical rhythm will drive the muscle to start contracting again. So CPR isn't the treatment, all it's doing is it's buying time. And sometimes it can be successful. And certainly doing nothing means the person will die. So advanced slide, please, Julie. So when I say sometimes, I think it's really important that we understand what we're talking about here, because usually when we see CPR, we see it on the telly. And when we see it on the telly, we see somebody having a cardiac arrest, we see somebody doing CPR first aid. Sometimes we'll see that it'll be a hospital drama, so the medics will do that extra thing of putting a tube down their throat and squeezing oxygen through a bag into the person's lungs. And towards the end of the program, we tend to see them sitting up in bed, having a cup of tea, chatting to their family. And what we know in soap operas is that the success rates are very high. They're higher in America than in the UK. So around about 70% average success for CPR in soaps in the United States, and about a 58 to 60% success for CPR in soaps in the United Kingdom. But in real life, it's very much less good than that. If somebody's in hospital when their heart stops, so they're surrounded by kit and equipment and people who know exactly what to do, then the survival rate to leaving hospital is round about 20%, 2 people in 10. If somebody has a cardiac arrest outside hospital, even if there's somebody standing close by who starts CPR straight away, the survival rate to leave hospital is just a little bit less than 10%. And a lot of those people will not be sitting up to have cups of tea with their families. Incomplete recovery is very often the norm. That might mean things like the heart has been permanently damaged, or it might mean that the brain has been permanently damaged, and that might mean the person has difficulties with memory or balance or speech or movement, or it might mean that the person is left permanently in a state of non-consciousness of self, but still breathing. So their body is technically alive, but they no longer are able to interact with the people that they love. And I put a little web link there for more information for people who might be interested in following up those data. So that's a bit gloomy, isn't it? So if we move on to the next slide, let's think about whether or not we can predict who will survive and recover. And the answer is to a certain extent, we can. So if you advance the slide, Julie, the best chance is for people who are fit, whose body organs are working well, and they have their cardiac arrest either in a hospital where they're surrounded by the right people, or they have their cardiac arrest in a public place where somebody around and about, a bystander, can do effective CPR. And to do effective CPR, people need to have been trained. If they're lucky, their heart rhythm can be corrected by defibrillation, and that very much improves the chances of somebody surviving. But it means that the defibrillation needs to be rapid, so you stand a better chance if there's a defibrillator somewhere nearby you. And there's more information about learning how to do CPR and learning how to fundraise for defibrillators in your community on that website there for the Resuscitation Council. And if you advance again, Julie, think about the lower chances. Well, they're kind of the opposite of the best chances. We've got less chance of surviving a cardiac arrest if our organs are already struggling due to a variety of things. So it might be previous organ damage. Maybe we've worked in an environment where there's been a lot of industrial dust that's damaged our lungs. Maybe our lungs have been damaged by smoking ourselves or by inhaling smoke from somebody else in our household. Maybe we've been exposed to chemicals. Maybe we've had a long-term condition that has been causing damage maybe to our heart, maybe to our kidneys, maybe to our lungs. And I think it's really important to say that's not the same as living with a disability where you can have a perfect set of organs in a body that is perhaps musculoskeletally less able, for example. So we're talking very specifically here about those vital organs and their level of fitness. It might be somebody who was previously very fit, but who currently is very seriously ill, maybe with an overwhelming infection or overwhelming poisoning, or has been very badly injured in an accident. So they've got a current severe illness that's damaging one or several of their organs. And sadly for all of us, simply our organs are the same age that we are. And one of the things that's been really shocking for me is, as a fit woman, as a runner, as a person who is an able-bodied person, to see myself in the list of people who are at increased risk of dying from COVID simply because I've passed my 60th birthday is profoundly shocking to me. But it's not a judgment about me or the way I've looked after my body. It's simply a statistical probability based on how well our organs are likely to be at a particular age. If we advance the slide again. So we'll just review what we've said so far. Thanks, Julie. So CPR is first aid, and it's first aid when everything is working and then the heart stops. The heart stops first, and then all of the other consequences are a consequence of the heart stopping. It works for between 1 and 2 people out of 10, and public education improves bystander CPR, and the Resuscitation Council in the United Kingdom is trying to drive more and more education for bystander CPR so that we can improve those rates. People who have long-term or recent but very severe health problems have lower survival than healthy people, even when CPR is started promptly and given very effectively. And older people have lower survival than younger people, even when CPR is started promptly and given effectively. So we need to think about when is it going to help and when might it not help. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 scenarios. So the next slide, please, Julie. So let's think first of all about a person in full health whose heart stops suddenly and unexpectedly, and their other organs are healthy when their heart stops. We know now that rapid start of CPR gives them the best chance of survival, and their chance, unless they're in hospital, is around about or a little less than 10%, with a significant chance of long-term problems. Would they want CPR? Well, if they would, that's not a problem, because if there's a bystander, they'll start straight away. Because the person's unconscious, they can't tell us whether or not they would want that. But if they wouldn't want it, how would we know? And there is a group of people who would not want to take the 90% chance of not surviving, and then the several percent chance of being a survivor and yet not fully surviving in the way that they currently enjoy living. And that's an important personal autonomous decision that some people elect to make. In the next scenario, so Julie will advance the slide, we've got a person with long-term health problems whose heart stops unexpectedly, and still starting CPR rapidly will give them the very best chance of survival, but their chance of survival now is very low indeed because of known organ damage. Now, we wouldn't know we were that person unless a person who knows us and who knows about our organ damage, maybe one of the specialists in the hospital who looks after us, maybe our GP, has had a chance to have a conversation with us about how much or how little CPR would likely to be of benefit to us should our hearts stop unexpectedly. But we're all entitled to have a conversation that tells us what those chances are and On the basis of that, we can decide whether or not we would want CPR to start. And then we have to work out, how would people know? And it's the how would people know question that is the real difficulty here. As soon as the heart stops beating, the brain is deprived of enough oxygen to think clearly. Within seconds, the person has lost consciousness and has dropped to the ground. They cannot tell us what their wishes are. So if somebody wants to elect ahead of time not to receive cardiopulmonary resuscitation, then they make a do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation decision. And when they've made that decision, it has to be recorded in a place where people can know about it. And that is a huge conundrum, because actually having it tattooed on our chest or on our forehead doesn't make it the legal document. It needs to be on a document that communicates that I've thought about this carefully and I know that this is what I want. And because starting CPR is a clinical decision, or it used to be before we were teaching bystanders, we've developed a tradition from the 1960s when CPR would only have been in a coronary care unit, and a doctor who might be looking after a patient would realise that this person was no longer well enough to benefit from CPR. So there would be a doctor-to-doctor note that said, if this person's heart stops, you won't be able to restart it because of all of these complicated cardiac reasons. So this is my note to my colleague to say, don't go there. And gradually, as we've taught more and more people to do CPR, and we've extended the number of people who might benefit from bystander CPR, the tradition of it being a doctor-to-doctor communication hasn't yet been broken. So it's still a medical certificate that confirms that this person has decided that they don't want to have CPR, or that their doctor has realised that CPR can't possibly be of benefit to them, that instructs, for example, an ambulance crew or an out-of-hours general practitioner that CPR is not to be started for this person. And then the third scenario is a person with a terminal illness whose organs are gradually shutting down. And the process of usual dying in humans is that our organs gradually become less proficient, we lose energy, we become more weary, we sleep more, we gradually lose consciousness. Our blood pressure is dropping lower and lower. It's carrying less and less oxygen to all of those organs, including our brain, until eventually our breathing very gently stops. And several minutes after breathing stops, the heart will eventually stop. The heart stops last. This is a very different situation from the heart stops first and unexpectedly. CPR will not restart life. But because an ambulance crew who arrives at somebody's house, or an out-of-hours GP who hasn't met you before won't know when they first arrive that this is an expected dying, then a do not attempt CPR certificate might be the way to help not to intrude on a family's last peaceful moments with a dying person by somebody stepping them all aside to start CPR. So the next slide, please. So thinking about making a do not attempt CPR decision, a DNACPR, and I'm using the words do not attempt very deliberately here. In the olden days, and still in America, they call it do not resuscitate, as though I could resuscitate and I'm chosen not to, rather than actually I could attempt to resuscitate, but the odds against it being successful are very, very high. So here are the categories: that CPR could work, but the person doesn't want it. They understand completely that not starting CPR means that if their heart stops, they will die, but they are making a personal advanced decision to refuse CPR as a treatment. And there are certificates that we can make out that are legally binding advanced decisions to refuse treatment. But because the decision about CPR has to be made very, very quickly, if somebody makes an advanced decision to refuse treatment that includes CPR, there's usually also a DNACPR certificate, so that it's at the front of the case notes or it's carried on the person, so that people can find it very quickly and either not start or stop when they discover that it's contrary to the person's wishes. The next category, Julie, is because CPR couldn't work. The person's body is already way too damaged, either because they have a long-term illness that has been damaging heart, lungs, the carriage of oxygen around the body, the electrical wiring of the heart, the muscle of the heart itself, or they are now very, very sick with a recent and severe illness. And this is a medical treatment decision. And if a doctor or a multidisciplinary team decide that a person could not be rescued from death by CPR, then they will let each other know by making a DNACPR certificate. But the law requires us also to make that known to the patient if they want to have that discussion with us, or to the people who are the patient's representatives, next of kin, family, the people who really mind about what's happening to this person. So it's very clear that although this is a medical decision, it's a decision that patient and or family should be made aware of. And third, please, Julie, is that CPR wouldn't work because the person is dying. And in dying, when the heart stops last, that's not a cardiac arrest. But families sometimes think that somehow CPR might bring the person back for a few hours, a few days, a few weeks. And any of us who have been bereaved know that we would give anything for those extra hours or days or weeks. So it's really important that we've had conversations with those families so that they understand that CPR is not going to rescue their beloved from death, and that when they die, we won't be jumping on their chest to try to keep their circulation going. And so my last slide is a summary of what we've been talking about. And I think what we're talking about is communication. Compassionate, deep conversations that allow people to reach an understanding of their individual risks and the possible benefits to them. And some of the letters that were circulating during the COVID pandemic suggested and worried people that actually risks might be measured on a population basis. Anybody with a particular characteristic might not get an ambulance, might not get a ventilator, might not get CPR. That's absolutely not the way the law works. And each of these decisions needs to be a carefully weighed, either personal decision if CPR could work but the person doesn't want it, or a clinical decision if no matter how much the person might want it, CPR would not be able to restart their life. That means that this might not be a one-off discussion. This might be a series of discussions. It might be a lot of thinking. It might be a lot of discussions with our beloveds after we've had a discussion with our doctor or the nurse who supports us best. And these are highly skilled conversations. And the doctors and nurses who undertake these discussions need to be trained. They need practice and feedback and reflection, and they need to keep doing that. Anybody who has any skill, whether it's a surgeon with his operations, or it's you're playing golf and what your handicap is, or whether it's making tiny balsa wood models, or whether you're a wonderful embroiderer, whatever your skill is, you maintain it by constant practice. And so what I want to say as I finish is that this is a nuanced, skillful, personal, compassionate, really important conversation or level of set of conversations. And I think that level of nuance is very rarely represented either in media stories or soap operas or TV reports. And it's those nuances that we're here to talk about today. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. There's already some wonderful comments coming through the question box saying how clear and concise it was, and it's been really helpful already hearing some of the things that you've been talking about. I'm going to introduce Mathieu Culverhouse now, who's going to talk about the legal side of this issue. Thanks, Mathieu.
Hi, thank you very much. Yes, I'm Matt Culverhouse. I'm a partner at Irwin Mitchell Solicitors. I specialise in health and care law and the law around mental capacity, which means that I often find myself advising clients and representing clients in cases and issues around end-of-life care, end-of-life treatment. And the first thing I want to say is I completely agree with Kathryn that this is all about communication. I was thinking we could almost have made that the title of this talk, that it's all about communication. It's just so important that people have these discussions and get the information that Kathryn was just taking us through there, which that's right, isn't it? It's not represented properly in the media, it's not represented properly in the TV shows that we see and the representations we have of CPR, and many people would make radically different decisions about their future care if they only had the opportunity to have these discussions. I'm going to talk very briefly about the legal background and some of my own experiences around these issues, but I do want to emphasize that because I'm a lawyer, of course, I only see the cases where there's a problem, where a problem's arisen. I only see the situations where something's gone wrong, and I always have to stop and remind myself, and I think it's important to emphasize here, that the vast majority of the time, the vast majority of clinicians in my experience are as compassionate and as Kathryn, and recognise the importance of communication in the way that Kathryn's emphasised there. And these decisions are happening day in, day out between clinicians and patients without issues arising, because it's involves an open dialogue, open discussion, and at the end of that discussion, both sides, clinician and patient, have reached an agreement. They've understood where the other one's coming from, and they've reached an agreed decision on what's going to happen in terms of the future care planning. And similar applies to the cases that appear in the media and the press. We only ever really see stories, bad news stories about these issues, but there's plenty of good practice going on out there, so I really think it's important to emphasize that. And this issue of communication really comes through from the law. As you'll see here, I've said, emphasized that the decision of whether to have a do not attempt to resuscitate CPR notice, I mean, it's a clinical decision, but as with any clinical decision, that really ought to be made in dialogue between the patient and clinician. We all know that we can't force clinicians to provide care to us, provide particular treatments to us if they don't think that's clinically appropriate. You can't force the NHS to provide treatment to you except in, well, extraordinary circumstances. And it's also important to emphasize that once a decision has been made of this nature, it's not necessarily binding on other clinicians, though of course it will weigh heavily in any future decisions that clinicians might make when they're faced with a patient who has had one of these notices placed on their records. But as I say, that the courts have emphasised the importance of communication, and have held that in order for a DNACPR decision to be lawful, the clinician must involve the patient in the decision. And I want to emphasise that involvement of the patient in the decision-making process, unless that would cause the patient harm to do so, to involve them. And I'm sure you'll recognise that it's only going to be in the most extreme of circumstances where it might possibly cause the patient harm to involve them in such a decision. It would only be in a very rare situation, I would say. And the courts have also held that clinicians must tell the patient of the decision before they then proceed to applying the DNACPR notice. This then gives the opportunity to the patient to seek a second opinion unless the decision has already been made through a multidisciplinary team decision-making process in the first instance. And what the courts have also held is that in situations where the person concerned, the patient, doesn't actually have the mental capacity to be involved in the decision-making process, then the clinicians must involve those interested in the patient's welfare, and that's adopting the language that some of you may be familiar with under the Mental Capacity Act, which talks about decisions being made on behalf of a person who doesn't have the capacity to make that decision. Must be made in that person's best interests, and the best interests checklist contained within the Mental Capacity Act makes it very clear that that must involve, where appropriate and practicable, liaising and consulting with those interested in the person's welfare, which in practice means the person's family and friends. And we all saw, I'm sure, at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak, there were some some frankly terrible stories of DNACPR notices being applied in a blanket fashion, but it was very pleasing to see that many different organisations put out clarifications and made it very clear, including Baroness Campbell herself, putting out letters making it clear that, as we've just been hearing from Kathryn as well, that can't be, that it can't be done that way. These decisions cannot be made in a blanket fashion in this way. It must be an individual decision made on the individual facts of a particular case. And so we had very helpful clarifications early on from NHS England, the Department of Health and Social Care, the Royal College of Nursing, and so on. And it's also, I think, helpful that the courts, another reason that's helpful that the courts have emphasised the importance of involving patients in these decisions is that it seems to me that then that opens up the possibility of having much broader discussions about future care planning in general. And there are a number of other issues that could be tackled at the same time as having this specific discussion about CPR, about a wide range of future care options for an individual. And it's obviously very good practice to have these discussions early on and openly and as an ongoing dialogue. As a lawyer, as I said at the beginning, the cases that do come to me, it's really striking how often the issue that's at the heart of the case that comes to me is, frankly, a breakdown in communication between the patient or their family and the clinicians, and that can go either way. It could be, communication is obviously a two-way street, and I've seen breakdowns which perhaps could be attributed to issues on both sides of that particular equation. But really, so often the cases that come to court, when you look at where things went wrong and what could have been done to avoid the situation ever having come to court, it's because there wasn't really effective communication from an early stage. And again, emphasising that I'm really not saying that this is a very common problem, but when the cases do come to me, one other pattern that I've noticed is unfortunately, sadly, where family members have approached us and they're saying that family members in hospital and they've found a DNA CPR notice on their records, and this reading the records for themselves was the first that they'd ever heard of it. And sadly, that seems to me to be a fundamental breakdown and a fundamental failure to apply the law to involve the patient and to involve their family. In practical terms, what we as lawyers do in that situation is write to the clinicians, write to the hospital to point out that this has happened, to point out that it shouldn't have happened, to ask them to withdraw the notice until they then had the opportunity to consult with the patient or with the family members if that's appropriate, and if appropriate, give them the opportunity for a second opinion if that turns out to be necessary. And in my experience, that simple act of sending the letter to the clinicians, albeit I recognise that having the power of a lawyer's letterhead is something somewhat different to what the patients will be able to do on their own, that usually results in starting that process of having that dialogue, and frankly nearly always resolves the issue without the need for any further legal involvement. So like I say, I emphasise that these are the rare cases, but I recognise that is what people are worried about. And on that note, I think it's probably an appropriate time to hand over to Sue, who's I think going to take us through some of the other issues that people have had concerns about.
Thanks, Matthew. Hi, Sue. Welcome.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Julie mentioned in her introduction that I've been a friend of Baroness Campbell for more years than I care to remember, and probably more years than she cares to remember, to be honest. So it felt appropriate that I should talk to you today. Also, for people who don't know me, I have been a disabled person all my life, and in the last few years I have additionally gained some long-term health conditions, being very greedy, you see, and also and also I have given some thought myself to advanced care planning. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Jane's story, and this is no secret, and I know Jane won't mind it being shared. And in fact, she's shared this on a number of occasions, including during interviews on BBC Radio 4. So Jane had the experience that she was having one of her chest infections, which is very prone to, and her partner found that that there was a DNACPR notice concerning Jane. Well, of course, you know, anyone who knows Jane knows that she's a very determined person, and there's no way that she or her partner were going to allow the end to come. So her partner actually raced home. He got photos of Jane and all the things that she's achieved in her life. So he put up on her bed, for example, a photo of her when she received her honorary doctorate from Bristol University. And through conversation, this notice was removed. I also know of other friends to whom disabled friends to whom this has happened. So it's understandable that disabled people are really concerned and quite frightened by the pandemic and what might happen to us. And at the beginning of lockdown, I think nobody was really clear on how the pandemic would pan out, as it were. And we were seeing GPs contacting patients, apparently, according to press reports, urging people to sign DNACPR forms. So a lot of concern. At Disability Rights UK, what did we do about this? Well, we worked with others. Like In Control, and a letter was drawn up expressing concern that, as has been mentioned, was drawn up with the assistance of Baroness Campbell, and that was put on the Disability Rights UK website. And within 24 hours, we had over 2,000 signatories from disabled people, our allies and organisations all concerned. And I'm pleased to say that there was a response, a response statement from the Care Quality Commission, the British Medical Association, the Royal College of General Practitioners and the Care Provider Alliance. And that statement made it very clear that disability cannot be used as a blanket reason for putting a DNA CPR notice on anyone's notes. And so I think that that's reassuring and clear, as the others have said. So what's happened since then? Well, a lot actually. We had a roundtable event online, of course, that was chaired by Baroness Campbell, and there are all sorts of people there, all the people on your panel today, and senior leaders from health and social care, as well as disabled people. and we had a really good discussion about care planning and what should happen. And out of that roundtable, a joint statement was issued, which you can find on NHS England's website, and it was brought together by James Sanderson, who is the Director of Personalisation for NHS England. And that joint statement, it talks about personalised approaches to care and treatment. And this is really what it's all about. It's taking that personalised approach, that approach that says it's not about one size fits all. It's not a blanket. Well, you have a disability, therefore it's DNA CPR notice that's put in your notes. And I think it's important to say that I don't feel it's a battle out there between disabled people and clinicians. Actually, as disabled people, we have many allies who really understand these issues. But we do have a little way to go, I would say, because I think it's inevitable that we are all subject to what happens in society generally, and I think it's no secret that disabled people have some way to go before society, all of society, treats us as equal citizens. And I think that there is a lot of misunderstanding and misconception about. And so it's inevitable that sometimes in a health setting, the value of our lives is not completely understood because the people who are thinking about the value of our lives are not experiencing the things that we experience. And they may think that actually our lives are less fulfilled and more difficult than we are actually experiencing. And I see only today actually that NHS England have released the 4th annual report into the deaths of learning disabled people. These days, every death of a learning disabled person in a healthcare setting has to be investigated. And one of the things that they're saying in that report is that there is still a little too much blanket use of DNA. You know, it's hard to say, isn't it? DNA CPR notices. So it's good that we're having this discussion today. Discussion will be helpful not only to disabled people but to clinicians as well. So what can we disabled people do about it? Well, we can with our families and our friends, we can look to producing our own advanced care plan on what we want to happen to us, how we want to be treated, what we would find acceptable. And this is a very good thing to do anyway, because it helps you think through, well, what is it actually that I want to happen to me? And it's actually quite a refreshing exercise, because I think that it clarifies your mind, and it's good for family and friends who are much clearer about what your needs are. Now, I don't want to say too much now, because I want people to be able to ask questions, but in my conclusion, can I recommend to you that you have a look at My COVID-19 Advanced Care Plan, which you'll find on NHS England's website. Now, I've filled in one of these forms. It's very easy to fill in, but it asks the sort of questions which I think are really important. So, who are your main contacts? Who do you want the health staff to get in contact with? Because let's face it, at the heat of the moment, that information may not be readily available. And speaking for myself, I live on my own. So that kind of question is really, really important. And then the other questions on the form are things like, obviously, your name, but how you want to be called. That's really, really, really important. I've certainly been in hospitals enough to know that I get called Susan, which I absolutely hate. And I would rather, if I'm coming round after an operation, that somebody's saying, Sue, Sue, because I'm more likely to respond, to be honest. And then, most importantly, I think, the form asks you a little bit about yourself. I say that's important because the more we know about each other, the more we understand each other, and the more we value each other. And going back to the example I gave of what happened to Baroness Campbell, it was knowing about her, knowing what person she was, what she'd done, that was so important in the conversation with the medical staff, because it makes you human. And we're all interesting people, actually, all of us. We have done things in our lives that are of interest to others. So I think that bit on the form is particularly important. So I would urge people, even if you don't put together an advanced care plan, depending on your circumstances, do have a look at filling in my COVID-19 advanced care plan, because it doesn't take very long, but it actually could make all the difference. Conversations, as the others have said, are very, very important. But we know that in the heat of the moment, things can go slightly awry. Hopefully, we won't experience a second wave of COVID-19. But if we do, we don't know what the size of it is, and we don't know what's going to happen. Fill in the form, and I think that you will feel much more comfortable and secure in leading your life, and hoping that you don't contract the virus. So, in summary, I think we've moved a long way during the pandemic. It was very scary at first, but I think the message is well that it is all about personalization. It's a personal conversation, and it's all about what you choose for yourself and how that is communicated. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue. And I'm so sorry about these pop-ups. This is the joy of having teams that sort of pop up in the chat box as well. So I'm sorry about that. Thanks, Sue. So we're going to move now on to questions. And there's some questions that are already in the box. But if you remember, you can put your hand up and we could come along then and unmute you to ask the question live on the webinar. So there's been some lovely comments, Kathryn, from people saying, it's been really helpful and sensitively delivered. The history and content was explained really, really well. There were some comments about the media misrepresentation and a query of sort of all our kids are taught CPR. So do they receive information about what the survival chances are, and how's that mismatch between we're all taught to do this now and things staying alive whilst we do CPR, and how does that match with the fact that actually the survival rates are very low?
Thanks, Julie. I think that's a really, really important question, and I have actually tried to get information from the Department for Education about this as CPR moves into the senior school curricula. I think it's very unlikely that they're going to be told that no matter how hard they try and how well they do it, 1 person in 10 will survive. And I think it's really, really important that our young people do understand that, so they're not left traumatized and blaming themselves when they are brave enough to have a go, because it takes enormous courage to step up and be a bystander who administers CPR. And those people who do try very often need careful support afterwards because of their experience, because mostly those people don't survive. So I think that there is an opportunity to talk about dying in the curriculum as part of health and as part of CPR, and also to help kids know that heart stops first, CPR, that's a really, really unusual way to die, that most people die of that process of gradual diminution that I was talking about before. So we've got a long way to go, I think, with public education, and there's a great opportunity to make the curriculum a lot richer, and therefore raise a new generation of people who are aware of our mortality, aware of the normal patterns of dying, how therefore you can plan ahead about things, and the right place of good bystander CPR can be part of that.
Thank you. And Matt, a couple of questions for you. So one is, does an MDT, does a multidisciplinary team decision automatically exclude then the consideration of getting a second opinion for a patient? And the second question is if that order has been placed on somebody, can a court deputy challenge that decision?
In relation to the MDT, I mean, I've yet to see the courts actually delve into that, but the case law that we currently have suggests that if there's been an MDT decision, then that takes away or deals with the clinician needs to get a second opinion, because it's effectively considered to be a sort of built-in second opinion. And whilst I said in my slides that this is ultimately a clinical decision, and yes, ultimately, if the person doesn't agree with it, if the patient doesn't agree with it, the clinician could still impose that decision. In my experience, once the need for dialogue, the need for communication has been complied with, it's extremely unusual for there to be a disagreement at the end of that process. I'd be interested to hear Kathryn's take on this as well, obviously being directly involved in these issues. But I think the emphasis on communication is so important that when people have a two-way dialogue and they fully understand these issues, in my experience, it's very unusual for there to be a disagreement at the end of that process. And then in answer to the question about a deputy, I presume in that situation, if we're talking about someone who's already been appointed as deputy, that I'm presuming is in relation to someone who doesn't have the mental capacity to be involved in these decisions, then first of all, the deputy should be involved in the decision-making process, as per the case law I mentioned earlier. And ultimately, there's a role for the court of protection in those situations where there's a dispute about what's in the person's best interest. And indeed, one of the leading cases in the court of protection involved exactly that, a person who was in hospital, and there was a decision about whether CPR should be provided if they deteriorated further.
Brilliant, thank you. Sharon, I'm going to come to you in 1 minute to see if you've picked up any questions, but there's another one who was very ill. They completed a health EPA and opted not to receive CPR. Would the wishes of that EPA be referred to should she have a medical emergency now?
I'm not quite sure I follow the full facts of it. I mean, it sounds like that is not technically an advanced decision that's been made there, because there are specific formalities that need to be complied with an advanced decision. But any evidence of the person's wishes and feelings that they've put in writing before they lost capacity are going to be, well, they're going to weigh very heavily in any future decisions around their best interests. Sorry, I didn't quite catch. Are we talking about a decision to refuse treatment in advance or to request treatment?
No, it opted not to receive CPR.
Right. Yeah.
But completed a health EPA.
Right. Well, as I said, so that's going to weigh very heavily in the best interest decision-making process later down the line, then, because you've got what appears to be good evidence as to what the person's wishes and feelings would be in this scenario.
Kathryn, anything to add on that?
So coming back to that situation that Matthew was talking about the communication, I think there are a few things to be clear about. First of all, for people who are wondering what MDT is, MDT stands for multidisciplinary team, and that would be the team of doctors and nurses and others who are experts in the condition that somebody's suffering from, who meet together to discuss all aspects of that person's care in order to pool their knowledge and reach the wisest set of options for the person's treatment. And at that point, they are options for the person's treatment. The lead clinician for that particular person would then go and have that discussion about, I've talked to the experts in our hospital, in our area, in the world sometimes, and we think that options that could be helpful for you would be maybe only one thing, maybe two or three things, and now the person has to exercise choice. If the person doesn't have capacity to make that decision, then there's provision under the Mental Capacity Act to ask their opinion if they're capable of expressing an opinion, and either if they haven't nominated a formal decision maker. Again, a lot of people don't realise their next of kin can't just make the decision unless they've done the paperwork for lasting power of attorney for health and welfare. Then it's a clinical decision that's made by the doctors and not by your family. So the doctor is having a conversation with the person, possibly with their beloveds, if that's the way they would like to handle it. And again, we have to ask permission to talk to people's families about them or even with them. Very often the conversation then enables somebody to understand that these are the options that could work for you. And we did also talk about these other options which, for this reason and that reason and this reason, don't apply to you, even though your friend or your person you know with the same condition as you has had that treatment. The reason it won't work for you. So it's all about transparency, isn't it? All about helping people to understand that nobody is trying to do anything but give them the best possible quality of life and health that we can help them to enjoy. And as Matthew says, having had a conversation that is frank and fearless like that, which actually does mean, are you frightened that you might die if we don't do that? Let's talk about dying. Let's talk about the things that you're worrying about. Actually opening that up, as Sue was saying before, is immensely reassuring to people, because now all the cards are on the table and we can really talk about, if you became so sick that you might be dying, who would you want there? What would you want to happen? What would you not want to happen? And that's the process of advanced care planning, which is much, much broader than just whether or not this person could benefit from CPR or would benefit from a ventilator. This is about who this person actually is and what really matters to them.
Thanks, Kathryn. We'll do one last question. I know we're running out of time and we did start a couple of minutes late. For those of you that don't get your questions answered, we will take them and we will do, as best we can, a question and answer sheet that we'll email out to everybody that's attended the webinar. So I don't want people to feel that their questions haven't been answered. Sharon, have you any final questions that have come through?
There's a comment from Amanda, who is saying that when she was in hospital, a consultant came round and said, I don't see any point in pummeling your chest if anything happens, and moved on to the next person. And Amanda went on to make a full recovery. The point being that a decision seemed to have been made, even though it wasn't needed to be used, based on her apparent disability rather than who she was as a person. It sounds like the communication again, as you were mentioning, Kathryn.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And Amanda, I'm really sorry that somebody was so rude and ungracious to you. There are two possibilities here. I'm going to take it away from it just being Amanda and it being a person with a disability in hospital, perhaps to have a routine operation. And they may be a person whose disability includes, for example, a change in the shape of their chest so that it wouldn't be possible to press on the chest and squeeze the organs in a way that would provide effective CPR. So for that person, CPR would not be an effective intervention, and it would be sensible to let them know that and to write a DNACPR notice so nobody makes the mistake of breaking that person's ribs without actually being able to help them while they're doing that. But it doesn't mean that the person can't recover from the operation that they've gone in with or the illness that they've gone into hospital with. So DNACPR isn't code for, I think you're going to die. It's very specifically, if this unusual occurrence should happen to you, this very specific stopping of your heart, CPR won't help you. So we won't be going to do that to you. And for some people, that's actually really good news. Thank God, I'm really glad to hear that you're not going to do that to me. And for other people, it's less good news. So we need to approach it gently, don't we? Not make a kind of off-the-cuff comment like that consultant did to Amanda. The really key part of communication is listening to people, not telling people. And Amanda wasn't listened to, and she was right to be deeply hurt.
Thank you. Lots of comments. Sue, lots of comments. They've already got your link to your advanced planning in the question box already. They're sharing that with each other and finding that really, really helpful. And other people have sort of commented on how helpful it's been. I know there are some questions that we haven't got through today, and we will take them away. But thank you for listening. I hope you found it helpful. We'll make sure that we email question and answers after the session. Many, many thanks to Kathryn, Matt and Sue. You've been fabulous, and thank you to Sharon and Gaynor in the background helping. Thanks for joining our webinar. There is a link here to Kathryn's book. It's brilliant. And again, we'll email that link round as well. And if people want to, people have any suggestions or ideas for future sessions like this that'd be helpful, please do let us know, either at In Control or Be Human, and we'll try and respond to any themes or ideas you've got. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Take care. Bye.